modern intercontinental wide-bodied jet airline. A car designed and built before the First World War. The fighter that flew into immortality in the Second World War. And the epitome of modern luxury on the road. All are linked by a single name.
There you see a priceless collection, some 700 of the most beautiful cars in the world, gathered from all over the world. Some of them literally priceless in that they are unique and irreplaceable. And together they represent the 75-year history of one name, Rolls-Royce, which is already immortal. And so, to mark this 75th anniversary, the Rolls-Royce Enthusiasts Club has organized this great gathering of the clans and cavalcade here at Duxford, one of the most historic airfields in the country. It's self-appropriate because our story is as relevant to the air as to the ground, and we are to see historic and beautiful aeroplanes as well as cars. And the preface to this story was written by a little car from France, the Decauville of 1901.
In 1903, Henry Royce, then a 40-year-old successful, though largely self-taught electrical engineer, bought one of these second-hand. It was his first car, but he was so dissatisfied with the little two-cylinder engine and its atmospheric valves that he resolved to build his own. And from that almost accidental beginning, the patrician figure of Sir Henry Royce, as he became much later, emerged as one of the great names of all time in British engineering. He modestly considered himself a mechanic rather than a creative genius, and it was on the 23rd of December 1904 that he went into partnership with the name now indelibly linked with his own, the dashing young pioneer, motorist and pilot, the Honourable Charles Rolls.
And this is the first product of that remarkable partnership, the two-cylinder 10-horsepower Tourer of 1904, if you like, the first production Rolls-Royce. Now, the secretary of the club is Eric Barras, himself a dyed-in-the-wool Rolls-Royce enthusiast, if ever there was one.
Indeed, Raymond, and on a day like this, when there is such a magnificent cross-section of Henry Royce's workmanship about us, you need to have a very hard heart not to feel very proud to be a Briton.
And so say all of us. I was drawing attention to the front of the car.
Yes. Well, the interesting thing about this is, of course, this is the start of the well-known Grecian Rolls-Royce radiator. Prior to that, the two little Royce cars had a flat-top radiator and the word Royce. Now, of course, Rolls became captivated, you know the rest of the story, and so Rolls-Royce was born, and this is what it looked like.
Let's have a look at his two-cylinder engine. Push rods, I notice, unlike the Decauville.
Well, of course, this layout became a classic Rolls-Royce layout, inlet over exhaust valve. And indeed, this same layout was used in many other models, including the post-Second World War models.
And we shall be seeing more of those later. But now let's move on to the three-cylinder car from 2 to 3, and a much more robust and business-like engine.
Oh, indeed, because Royce was working up through the cylinder, so to speak, really to try and find the perfect engine. And in producing a three-cylinder engine, of course, he preceded many modern motor manufacturers, because what he did was, in effect, to put half a six-cylinder engine on a common crankshaft.
Indeed, yes. From 3 on to 4, and the Light 20 of 1905. And when it comes to performance, this was a horse of a very different colour. This indeed was the car on which Rolls won the Tourist Trophy the following year, 1906.
Yes, it is an identical motor car. This is the famous Light 20, which was so beautifully restored by Stanley Sears some years ago. There are only 2 of these in the world, and we're very proud to have one here. A very fast motor car, a 75-mile-an-hour motor car today. which I think is really says the story of Rolls-Royce. It is so superb, and I don't know whether you'd like to look inside, but...
Always, always.
You see, again, the little classic. This time we have two blocks of two-cylinder engines together, but everything built to jeweler's standards.
So, 75 years after the creation of Rolls-Royce, this marvellous cavalcade at Duxford. Beautiful weather, beautiful machinery, and surely none more so than the group of cars leading the parade. The legendary Silver Ghosts, in production from 1906 to 1926, so even the youngest of them is now over 50 years old. And they, of course, were enjoyed by Charles Rolls for a mere 4 years because he was killed at Bournemouth in a flying accident as early as 1910. That's AX201, the 13th Ghost to be built, the property and pride of Rolls-Royce cars. All the bodywork is silver-plated.
Followed by the first Rolls-Royce to be exported to America, to the Rockefeller family in 1907. Here you've got a very nice view of the gas headlamps, which still work perfectly, the oil side lamps, and indeed a magnificent, truly heroic view of the front of the car. Internally, it was just as exquisite. Every single thing about it is perfectly made. The instruments are, every one of them, handmade, precision instruments. They work quite perfectly even to today. Artistry at its best. Look at the ratchet of that handbrake, and look at that astonishing audible means of warning.
The classic bulb horn, yes, without which no Silver Ghost is complete.
Indeed. And note the wheels. This car is probably unique in that it has the original wheel and tyre sizes, which is most unusual. Rather odd luggage accommodation, perhaps, but does feel picnic. And there, the Rolls-Royce chassis plate, common to every Rolls-Royce motor car.
And the bill of sale, £821 in total, and the profit noted on the back, £251. An amazing document. But, as I said earlier, the reputation of Rolls-Royce is as relevant to the air as to the ground. And that part of our story started in the First World War, although, of course, Charles Rolls had already killed himself by then, trying to improve on the Wright brothers' ideas about tail control surfaces. But this is one of the immortals of the Western Front, the two-seat F2B, the Bristol fighter, brisfit to its friends. Entered service with number 48 Squadron in France in April 1917. Powered by the Rolls-Royce Falcon, a liquid-cooled V12 engine, very much in accordance with the convictions of Henry Royce, producing 267 horsepower at 2,000 RPM from some 14.2 litres, but with a power-weight ratio of 2.8 pounds per horsepower, so it was pretty efficient. The Falcon was really a scaled-down version of the Eagle with an epicyclic reduction gear. This machine was actually built in 1918, but was reputedly still in service with the RAF in Turkey in 1921. You note the armament. The Bristol fighter was armed with a fixed Vickers machine gun for the pilot, firing through the air screw, while the Observer had that very useful pair of Lewis guns mounted on a scorf ring aft. And this was really a very successful fighter. Over 3,000 had been built by the end of the First World War. And of course, immediately post-war came the dawn of long-distance travel by air, for which the proven reliability of Rolls-Royce aero engines made them tailor-made. All cock and brown, proving the point in the first transatlantic flight ever in June 1919 in a modified Vickers Vimy powered by two 360 horsepower Rolls-Royce Eagles.
In the First World War, the company concentrated entirely on aero engine production. The few car chassis that were produced went into the famous Rolls-Royce armoured cars, immortalised by Lawrence of Arabia and still in use by the 11th Hussars in April 1941.
Well, of course, it was not surprising that the world's finest cars should appeal to the world's richest men, and between the wars, many of them were to be found in the princely palaces of the Raj. And quite a few of these amazing vehicles have now been brought back from India by your members, Eric, who apparently believe in dressing as appropriate to the occasion.
Yes, and in authentic detail. The decorations being worn by the driver, absolutely authentic, and so indeed are some of his passengers. The white car is another 20 horsepower car which belonged at one time to the Nawab of Bawalapur. And again, the driver is in the authentic dress of the period.
The plume goes very well with the overall style.
It does indeed. And here is the father of all the Indian cars. This belonged to the Maharaja of Rajkot, and it carries on the doors and windows his motto, which translated means an impartial ruler of men of all kinds of faith. I think that's most appropriate to this beautiful 1933 Phantom II, which spent so much of its life in India.
To return to the story of development, on to the 2025s, a logical step to follow the post-First World War 20 horsepower car, a car designed to meet the new social order and indeed the new social pressures of the period. And by the way, all these figures, which Eric and I mentioned, of course, refer to the old RAC rating of so-called horsepower, which governed the amount of road tax according to the engine size rather than the actual brake horsepower delivered. And in case you've ever wondered about it, the famous winged lady on the bonnet is more properly called the Spirit of Ecstasy. She was designed by Sir Charles Sykes in 1910.
A remarkable car with coachwork by Schutter and Van Berkel of Amsterdam, one of the very many specialist coach builders who plied their art on these superb chassis. Interesting to note the most unusual luggage carriers on each of the running boards, based on a Voisin design. And now, the most historic 25 of all time, Churchill's personal wartime taxi, carrying the Cinque Ports flag commemorating his Lord Wardenship.
Between the wars, the Brooklyn circuit near Weybridge in Surrey was the home of British motor racing. Thundering round the Byfleet banking, the big Bentleys fired the imagination of boys of all ages and carried the Union Jack to many famous victories at home and abroad. This was, after all, a romantic era, nurtured still in the traditions of Biggles and Bulldog Drummond, and the massive 8-litre Bentley was surely the most masculine car ever built. While this one was literally the property of P.G. Wodehouse. The late 20s and early 30s may be remembered for the Depression, but it was a period which still enjoyed style for those who could afford it, and the rest of us could drool over the advertisements in Punch and Country Life, read in the doctor's or the dentist's waiting room. As I said, without apology, a romantic era.
And the huge crowd totally caught up in the atmosphere of the occasion.
This is a 2530 Rolls of 1936, a brougham de ville by Windover, described in the catalogue as a truly exotic town car, and incidentally incarcerated by the Germans during the war. And the painted basket work, which you'll notice was no doubt what gave Peter Sellers the idea of finishing his Mini like that, 30 years later.
A beautiful Salmons drop-head coupe, Salmons of Newport Pagnell, who made these lovely soft tops, owned by and driven by Lawrence Dalton, who's produced so many of those beautifully illustrated Rolls-Royce books, wearing, incidentally, his old school blazer of many a year ago.
That's no mean achievement.
No, indeed not. And looking hale and hearty in it. Lawrence bought that car some years ago for a few £100s. Today, I suspect you would have to top the £20,000 if you could tempt him to sell it, which you won't be able to do. And here, the Wraith, the last of the small pre-war cars. Probably the most quiet-engined Rolls-Royce ever built. Beautifully proportioned, here in the Continental touring limousine form, designed for the last of the Grand Turismo, if you like. Note the little perspex roof to get a little added vision, I presume, as you were crossing the Alps, so that you didn't miss a peak.
And of course, in those days, individual craftsmanship could still earn a man a very respectable living, as well as a lot of job satisfaction, making the appointments for a car like that.
Indeed, and this toolkit. Every item, a perfect instrument, exquisite practicality.
The Gloucester Gladiator has to be, for people of my generation, the aviation equivalent of the 8-litre Bentley, I think. If that was the boy's own car, this was the boy's own aeroplane of the period. In fact, it first flew in 1934, was not ordered finally until July of the following year, and there is a school of thought which suggests that in view of other developments already apparent, it was a bad choice for the Royal Air Force of 1936. It had a 9-cylinder, 840 horsepower Bristol Mercury radial engine, as opposed to the liquid-cooled multi-cylinder V engines already pioneered and proven by Rolls-Royce. And this is probably not the time to go into a fairly complex technical and indeed political argument about it all, but I've no doubt of the views of Henry Royce and his colleagues as far as that engine was concerned. Suffice to say that this beautiful fighter, flying here at Duxford in the mid-30s, inspired a lot of young chaps like me into thinking that that was what they very much wanted to do. Douglas Bader and Bob Stanford, tucked to name but another couple of infinitely more distinguished starters. And of course, Faith, Hope and Charity, the 3 gladiators of Malta, were to fly into immortality, 5.5 years later. But those were remarkable times, and the Gladiator, despite or even because of the fact that it had nothing of Rolls-Royce in its specification, certainly has every right to be in an historic occasion of this kind, not least because it is a very beautiful aeroplane, and even Henry Royce would have granted that, I believe. And as the Gladiator lands, Eric Barris, let's go back to the story of the development of Rolls-Royce cars, because coming up in the cavalcade now is the Phantom 1.
The new Phantom, which followed the Silver Ghost in 1925. In 1919, to try to avoid the high import duty imposed by the Americans, the company opened a factory at Springfield, Massachusetts, where they manufactured complete chassis to precise United Kingdom standards. The Silver Ghost, the Phantom 1 and the Phantom 2 were made until the factory closed in 1931. In those days, of course, Rolls-Royce manufactured nothing but chassis, and one went to one's favorite coach builder and selected your own particular style and discussed every detail of its requirement. You looked upon its ultimate usage, whether it was foreign touring or whether it was to be a town car, and the car was then designed to your particular purpose. A lovely example here is a Phantom 2 with a Thrupp and Maberley body, which once belonged to the Prince Ali Khan, ably conducted by its owner, Richard Lowe. And here, the Gurney-Nutting Drophead Coupe. This famous coach builder used the designs of Captain H.R. Owen and is probably one of the most sought-after cars in the world. its owner, Jim Bidwell Topham, displaying a distinctly patriotic vein in the boater he's wearing today, very much in keeping with the period of the motor car, as is the blazer. And now the last of the great 4050s. This, the 1936 Phantom 3, a Sedanka de Ville by Windovers with, of course, the great V12 engine.
And your mention of that V12 engine, Eric, brings me back to what I was saying earlier about the Gloucester Gladiator, because from the outset, Henry Royce was a believer in the inline or V liquid-cooled engine as opposed to the air-cooled radial for aeroplanes. He admitted the idea was not his, it was the Hispano-Suiza engines of the First World War that led him to it. So when it came to the challenge of designing an engine to beat the Americans and the Italians in the Schneider Trophy races of the very early 30s, Royce had no doubt, and nor did R.J. Mitchell of Supermarine, who set about designing an airframe round that power unit. It was a seaplane, of course, and in 1931 it won the enormously important Schneider Trophy outright for Britain. And it was the precursor of what was to become a familiar and classic shape, the Supermarine Spitfire.
Spitfire 1 was, of course, the main mark of the machine used during the battle.
The only Allied aircraft to remain a frontline fighter throughout the war, it was in continuous production until 1947, during which time, and this is very interesting from the engineering point of view, its power was increased by 100%, its rate of climb by 80%, its weight by some 40%, and its maximum speed by 35%. Mutt Somers flew the first Spitfire on the 5th of March, 1936. It had been developed, as I said, from the Schneider Trophy winner, despite rather than because of the Air Council and the governments of the day, and Sir Henry Royce would not have turned in his grave over that. He had in fact died on the 22nd of April 1933, just before his 70th birthday, and his successors, notably Lord Hives, had pursued his same relentless dedication to excellence regardless of political whims and fancies. As a private venture, they had pressed on with the development of the Rolls-Royce Merlin, arguably the engine which won the war, and to which subsequently Lord Beaverbrook, as Minister of Aircraft Production, had the vision and dogged determination to pin the whole country's hope for the future. This is a Spitfire 1A. Again, it was here at Duxford that the first RAF Spitfire squadron was equipped before the war, but effectively just in time for the Battle of Britain. And so as the Spitfire makes its classic curving approach to land, we see once again the aircraft which was designed just in time. But then, of course, the problem became to build enough to equip the new squadrons as well as make good the losses once the fighting had begun. And it was that requirement which forged the remarkable unity of the whole country in those days. All of industry turned its unified action towards this great and indeed unique effort in history, so that the challenge in the skies over Britain could be met and ultimately repulsed. For any ex-Spitfire pilot, sitting in this cockpit once again has to be a bit of a sentimental trip. After all, those of my generation literally grew up here. I think it's fair to say that
We plumbed the depths and scaled the heights of human emotion with these controls under our hand. Left hand on the throttle, right hand on the stick, right thumb for the gun button. One simply became a part of the finest fighter in the world, and it was a schoolboy dream come true. As to the engine, well, its operation was simplicity itself, which was perhaps just as well for simple, some may say thick, fighter pilots. The left hand on the throttle, of course, controlled the boost or power. The pitch lever governed the revs. And with the big Merlin purring away in front, one could wish for nothing more in the world. Its response was instantaneous. One demanded a hell of a lot from it, and one invariably got it. The oil pressure gauge, the oil temperature gauge, and the radiator temperature gauge told you if all was well, and if it wasn't, there were two simple alternatives: stay with it or get out. Of course, the size and shape of the engine in front meant that visibility dead ahead was zero on the ground or landing, but we had a few tricks to cope with that. One had total confidence in both the engine and the airframe, and in retrospect, I know that those were the happiest days of my life.
So now, as we watch that graceful shape, let's listen again to the song of the mighty Merlin. Here's the Spitfire's sister, the Hurricane. And again, almost the same note, but not quite, from the same Merlin engine. It was the Hurricane which in the Battle of Britain actually destroyed more enemy aircraft than all the other defenses put together. And finally, the 4 mighty Merlins in the Avro Lancaster. But as a soldier, Eric, you had some personal interest and indeed Rolls-Royce interest in the same period.
Yes, all Rolls-Royce car production was put aside during the war. The company's entire effort went into the Merlin. This is General Sir Bernard Montgomery's car, which landed on Juno Beach on the 9th of June, 1944.
So to the new generation of post-war cars. This is a Mark VI Bentley of 1948. Important, if only because for the first time it was manufactured complete with a standard steel body, unlike all its predecessors, which had been completed by specialist coach builders. And it was a Bentley. Now, Eric, the whole Bentley story was really quite involved.
Indeed, indeed. From the great days of W.O. Bentley and the classic vintage cars which thundered to victory at Le Mans with the British Union Jack in pride of place, they ran into considerable financial difficulty. They were making a very fine car, the 8-litre car, which did offer considerable opposition, hypothetical competition perhaps, to the Phantom II Rolls-Royce. So Rolls-Royce did the obvious thing. They bought them out to stifle the competition. But having done so, of course, a very considerable Bentley lobby came up and said, look, you bought them, you must make them. And so Henry Royce agreed that an experimental chassis, a 2.5-litre experimental Rolls-Royce chassis that never went into production, should form the basis of this car with the Rolls-Royce 2025 engine, cross-flowed, twin SU carburetors, and all sorts of nice things done to it.
The GT version.
The GT version, indeed. And from that sprang this whole range of Rolls-Royce Bentleys, because, quite honestly, the only Bentley part about it is the wing B and the B on the bonnet. They are really bull-nosed Rolls-Royces, but very beautiful cars they are. Now, the Silver Dawn followed the Mark VI in the immediate post-war days. Basically, a Mark VI Bentley with a Rolls-Royce radiator, although this one has a special body by James Young.
The chassis was common to the first series of post-war cars, including the Silver Wraith. The differences were minor, mainly carburation.
Ah, now here's a car of which I have personal memories, the 1950 Silver Wraith, with which Mike Cooper won the Concours d'Elegance in the Monte Carlo Rally and did it 3 years on the trot, as I recall. Of course, in order to be eligible, it had to complete the rally proper, and trying to get past that thing at 60 miles an hour plus with its opposite corners engaging the snowbanks on either side of the road was no mean achievement, I can tell you.
And the Silver Cloud 1 followed the Mark 6 range, still with a 6-cylinder engine, bored out, and what we see now is the whole range of the Silver Cloud in the S series. The beautiful S1 Continental, a drop-head coupe by Park Ward, owned originally and for many years by Rex Harrison. The post-war progression of Rolls-Royce cars was really in the traditional theme: continued development, continually striving to make a better, a more perfect machine, with the subtle difference that some of the cars carried a pressed steel body, of Rolls-Royce origin, of course.
Back to the air, and the world's first prop jet airliner, the Vickers Viscount, powered by 4 Rolls-Royce Darts, certainly one of the most successful commercial aeroplanes ever built by the British industry. Sold in quantity off the drawing board by Sir George Edwards, even before it first flew in, 1949 or thereabouts. Now, I confess a close personal feeling for this aeroplane since I flew it as 5th acting unpaid pilot and broadcaster in the New Zealand Air Race of 1953. Would you believe 40 hours, 43 minutes to Christchurch, which is about what a scheduled 747 would take you today. Since then, of course, Viscounts have sold all over the world, including the United States. And here is another example of the great breakthrough into the United States market. The Grumman Gulfstream, built by the Grumman Aircraft Corporation, one of the historic US manufacturers, powered by 2 Rolls-Royce Spey turbofans of some 11,500 pounds of thrust. This 11-seat executive jet first flew in 1966 and is currently the Grumman demonstrator in Europe. I think it's true to say that without Rolls-Royce, British aviation has not penetrated the frontiers of the American aviation lobby. But again, Eric, let me take you back to the story of Rolls-Royce cars and the continuous process of uprating and development which you were just talking about.
Yes, the story really continues on this precise basis laid down by Royce, that you develop, you continue to try and make a better product. You do not discard something as long as there is still development quality. And after the war, the 6-cylinder engine cars carried on to this, the Silver Cloud 1, a beautiful example, a drop-head coupe by H.J. Mulliner. I doubt whether any coach builder could exceed Mulliner's in this type of coach work. It is living luxury and a highly practical motor car, the last of the 6-cylinder engine cars, because very shortly after that came a considerable change and development in this, the Silver Cloud 2, fitted with the light alloy V8 engine, the engine which continues to this very day under development and producing more horsepower, more economy, and still capable of carrying a heavy body.
And of course, the names are another example of this continuity, Eric.
Oh, of course. They all have a kind of spectral quality, ghosts and shadows and clouds and dawns, which is right, because Rolls-Royces don't really, they're not driven mechanically. They float, they carry you. They're soulful motor cars. the difference between the, for example, Silver Cloud and the S-series Bentleys literally is the shape of the radiator. We move on here to the Cloud 3. Now, the Cloud 3, produced in 1962, was virtually the same engine, but with this continued progression, more power, slightly quieter perhaps, because every part of the chassis was improved as it went along, a process which continues. You've seen a Cloud drop head coupe, you will see an S3, virtually the same thing, but this one with the lovely Mulliner flying spur body. And again, you see the emotiveness of the name, Flying Spur.
Yes, I must say, that's a classic, isn't it?
And, of course, the one-off, if you like, in the Rolls-Royce world, the Phantoms, the post-war Phantoms, the P4, the P5, and the current P6. Now, these cars were designed and developed for heads of state and people of great importance, or people with big stomachs and long legs and huge bank accounts.
Well, now, here's an aeroplane of which I'm absolutely certain the dashing Charles Rolls would have approved. In fact, I'll bet he'd have given his eye teeth to have flown the little Wallace Autogyro, even though it is powered by a 1634cc McCulloch four-cylinder two-stroke engine, which Royce would certainly have questioned. Now, if you saw the James Bond film, You Only Live Twice, you'll remember the hair-raising sequences in the air, all flown as today by the designer and builder of the aircraft, Wing Commander K.H. Wallace. Incidentally, he holds virtually all the world autogyro records with this machine. In sheer speed, 130 miles an hour, 15,220 feet of altitude. I must say, he's doing the very opposite in this display. And the only thing that stopped him at in excess of 15,000 feet was lack of oxygen. And now, despite this very theatrical display, Wallace takes this little aeroplane very seriously and is now not the only one who is beginning to see a real military potential for this type of aeroplane. On this one, of course, the missile and the machine guns are just toys, but it's not too difficult to see an aeroplane doing that and meaning it. Autogyro, of course, because the rotor blades windmill, they're not driven by the engine. But just look at the amount of lift they generate and how brilliantly displayed by Wing Commander Wallace. At last, he's hit the target. Yeah, thank you very much. And that's an example of the stability of the aeroplane. You'd be pushed to do that in a conventional helicopter like this. I say more conventional in design, but still a very advanced type of rotor aircraft, albeit a helicopter rather than autogyro, the Westland Aerospatiale WG-13 Lynx, as its name implies, one of the current family of Anglo-French helicopters in service on both sides of the Channel, powered by two Rolls-Royce GEM gas turbines of 900 shaft horsepower, and an extremely handy aeroplane for its multi-purpose, multi-service role. Now bought also by West Germany, Argentina and Brazil, as well as the British and French armies and the Royal Navy. This one is in fact a Royal Naval Lynx from 702 Squadron at Yeovilton, flown by Lieutenant Les Port. And the Lynx is becoming increasingly important as the air element in some of the Royal Navy's most modern ships and weapons systems, such as the Type 42 cruiser, including HMS Cardiff when she's completed, and the Type 22 and Leander class frigates. But I wonder what Henry Royce would have said had it been suggested to him that the descendants of his aero engines would power a machine like that. There it is, going backwards a good deal faster even than one of your ghosts, Eric.
Indeed, I think Henry would have been bewildered, but absolutely delighted.
The Westland Aerospatiale Lynx, Rolls-Royce powered. Back to civil aviation and Britain's first executive jet, the Hawker Siddeley 125. First flown in 1962, powered by two Rolls-Royce Bristol Siddeley Vipers of some 3,100 pounds thrust. The RAF calls its version the Dominie, as well as a trainer it's used for the VIP flight at Northolt, and is really now very familiar all over the world. A particularly good-looking mini-jet, in my view, cruising at around 420 miles an hour with a range of getting on for 2,000 miles. This particular aeroplane is now some 15 years old. It was originally the property of a shipping magnate who shall remain nameless, and was bought by Rolls-Royce and is now used as a company aeroplane based at Bristol. And just the thing for popping down to Duxford on a day like this. And now in total contrast, not least because it is quite unlike any other aeroplane in the world, the Hawker Siddeley Harrier, the world's first operational V-STOL jet. Powered by a single vector thrust Rolls-Royce Bristol Pegasus engine, it's interesting to remember that more than 20 years ago now, when the technical battle for this unique performance began, the Rolls-Royce aviation experts were convinced that the way to do it was to have separate engines for lift and propulsion, as indicated by their original flying bedstead experiments. Sidney Cam and his Hawker team, however, had a major fight from the outset to persuade the British government that this was the right way to do it, with a single engine and swivel nozzles.
Raymond, here's another example of an aircraft engine in a different guise. Really astonishing. A competitive tractor powered by Packard Merlin engine made under license in America, installed in a chassis designed and built by its intrepid owner for the sole purpose of pulling heavy weights faster than anybody else. Now look at it accelerate. What a brave man he is. I reckon he's up to 55 miles an hour at this very moment. Quite definitely, quite unbelievable. Rolls-Royce did not only make luxury cars, their engines in diesel form power many, many commercial vehicles the world over.
And I'm sure, Eric, that you and your friends of the Rolls-Royce Enthusiasts Club must have been very impressed by the extraordinary diversity of vehicles illustrating that very point, which you have managed to get together at the Imperial War Museum in Duxford today. But of course you're not entirely doing this for fun, even though you are all enjoying yourselves.
No, indeed, this is quite true, Raymond. There is a very serious purpose behind this event, which is to raise money for the Sir Henry Royce Memorial Foundation. a permanent building which has been purchased, in which the archives of Rolls-Royce and a great deal of his engineering ability will be housed forever. It will have a museum, but its real purpose is to support young engineers in the hope that they too will try and follow in the footsteps of that very great man. We look now at some of today's motor cars, which really have the spirit of Royce about them. A Silver Shadow, driven by a lady, incidentally, followed by the immortal, I say it advisedly, Corniche drop-head coupe. Elegant, totally practical, alive with the spirit of Royce, and spanning 75 years of the best of British engineering.
So to the present day, the 1979 long wheelbase Wraith 2, yours, but I hasten to say not mine, for £46,000. 7-litre engine, but with automatic cruise control, claiming 19 to 20 miles to the gallon, fully air-conditioned, of course. It has a 55-channel radio with automatic waveband selection, so that from the car you can make a telephone call from anywhere in the world to anywhere in the world. 4,000 men contribute to the manufacture of this car, which takes 3 months. Its owner considers it to be a work of art. It is a car of infinite refinement. It is a car which I believe Sir Henry Royce might have approved.
Of this aeroplane, I'm quite sure he would have approved. The Lockheed TriStar, powered by 3 Rolls-Royce RB211 advanced technology turbofans, the Whispering Giants. Ironically, the development of this aeroplane and its engines came within an ace of finishing off both companies, perhaps marking the end of the chapter of private venture and enterprise for major technological ventures. Be that as it may, Rolls-Royce engines are well placed for the next generation of masterpieces in engineering, both on wheel and wing. So our thanks to you, Eric Barris, and the Rolls-Royce Enthusiasts Club for making us so welcome at your show. And may the next 75 years write a story as proud and as rich in British achievement as the past 3/4 of a century.